Absolutely. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, all set. Alrighty, well, thank you for having me. So, this is an introduction to infrared photography. My name is Rob Shea. As mentioned, I'm a landscape photographer. I've done a lot of videos on YouTube focused on infrared, and I like to share what I've learned with everybody. Infrared can be a complex topic, and so I like to make it easy for everybody. There's a lot of material that I've got to cover today, so if you feel like I'm going too fast, then we'll have a recording here you can look at, or all the topics that I'm covering are covered in even more detail in videos on YouTube, so feel free to check those out as well. So, you may be asking, what is infrared photography? So you may have seen images like this where the greens are white and the skies are blue. Or maybe you've seen something a little bit more colorful like this. Or maybe a high contrast black and white image. Or maybe an image with a deep black sky. That's a little bit unusual. Or maybe you've seen an image that has very unusual casts of red or violet in them. These are all basically variations of infrared photography. So, this is what I'd like to cover today. So, what is infrared photography? What are the styles of infrared photography? What's the equipment that you'll need to shoot infrared? How you can shoot infrared with your existing camera. You don't necessarily need a lot of fancy equipment. And then how do you process these images, which is, as I mentioned, can be one of the more challenging aspects of this. And then at the end, we'll do a full Q&A and answer as many questions as we can. All right, so let's dive into what is infrared photography. So in order to explain what infrared is, a touch of science is really helpful. So this is the electromagnetic spectrum. It is, of course, not to scale. The spectrum includes gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet light, visible light, infrared light, microwave, and radio waves. Visible light, the light that we see with our eyes, has wavelengths from about 400 nanometers to 750 nanometers. The number of nanometers measures the size of each wave. Our eyes actually don't see color. They see a particular wavelength of light, which our brains convert into color. So your eye detects a wavelength of 550 nanometers, but your brain sees green. I guess you could say that colors are a pigment of your imagination. So for conventional photography, most photographic film is designed to only be sensitive to visible light, just like our eyes, so it works really well. Digital sensors actually can capture light at a broader range, from 350 nanometers all the way to 1,000 nanometers, and this includes some near ultraviolet light, all visible light, and some near infrared light. In order to prevent the UV and the IR light from reaching the sensor, digital cameras contain a filter which blocks those types of light. That's called a hot mirror filter. So we have three methods of capturing infrared light. First, we can use a special film which is designed to be sensitive to visible and infrared light. So that's the first method that we have. Second, with digital cameras, we can use a filter to block more of the visible light than the hot mirror is blocking. So you end up with a battle between the hot mirror and the infrared filter, but that allows more infrared light to reach the sensor and capture more infrared light than visible light. And the final option is to convert a digital camera by removing that hot mirror filter. This conversion gives you access to the full spectrum that the sensor can detect. You can replace the hot mirror with a specific infrared or ultraviolet filter, or no filter at all, which results in a full spectrum conversion. And I'll cover all three of these methods of infrared shooting as we go. So before we get too deep into the technicals, let's talk a little bit about some of the styles of infrared photography. So there's many styles, and all of these styles are different combinations of infrared light, visible light, and ultraviolet light. However, I'll generally refer them all kind of collectively as infrared light or infrared photography. So first of all, we have what's called traditional infrared. And traditional infrared uses a 720 nanometer high pass filter. So what that means is that light below 720 nanometers is blocked. So that's most visible light. But a light above 720 nanometers is allowed to pass to the sensor. And so that includes a small slice of red light and infrared light. So plants actually reflect infrared light. Infrared light is not really useful in photosynthesis. And so as a result of that reflection of all of the infrared light, foliage looks white. And then in post-processing, we take the reds that result and swap them, do a color swap with blues, and that results in a more realistic blue sky. And this gives us the traditional infrared look. Black and white infrared consists of infrared light and some visible light. So black and white can be shot with a variety of infrared cutoff filters. It could be shot with as a black and white as a JPEG, or you can take an image as a RAW and convert it to black and white in processing. Deep infrared is the only variety that actually captures only infrared light. So no visible light, no ultraviolet light, just infrared light is deep infrared. Deep infrared is typically captured with a filter with a 750 nanometer or greater cutoff filter, so that we're eliminating all of that visible light and only capturing the infrared light. Typically, deep infrared images are also converted to black and white. Deep infrared images will feature really inky black skies or water, and also white foliage. Color infrared light captures some visible light, such as oranges and reds, as well as infrared light. The additional visible light adds vivid color to the foliage. And then after swapping reds and blues in the processing, skies are blue or teal, and then the foliage becomes yellow or orange. There's lots of creative options available for processing color infrared images. These will use a variety of high-pass filters, typically from around 470 nanometers to 665 nanometers. Most of my color infrared images are shot with a 590 nanometer filter. And a camera conversion is actually required to shoot in color infrared. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. So a converted camera is one in which, as I mentioned earlier, that hot mirror is removed, that hot mirror which blocks the UV and infrared light, which is standard in all digital cameras, and it's replaced with either a high-pass filter or no filter at all for full spectrum. Converting a camera typically costs around $275, and a conversion is essentially permanent. It will void your camera's warranty, and it becomes the new normal for the camera. But it's the only way to capture color infrared and some of the styles that I'm going to cover next. So the next style is full spectrum. So this is where we use a full spectrum camera, the one with the hot mirror removed. It's just replaced with a clear filter. So this allows the sensor to capture near infrared light, all visible light, and near ultraviolet light. And the resulting images have a red or violet cast from the additional infrared and ultraviolet light. Full spectrum cameras have an additional benefit that you can use additional lens filters to shoot a variety of other styles. So when you're shooting full spectrum, you're going to need a converted camera as well. Chrome is another style that mimics the look of Kodak aerochrome film. So aerochrome film used a interesting technique of remapping the film sensitivity to different colored dyes. So for example, red light that was captured was converted and displayed as green. infrared light that was captured was displayed as red. And these resulted in images with predominantly pink or red foliage. On digital cameras, the chrome style can replicate this effect with a multi-pass filter. So the multi-pass filter acts as a high pass, allowing the reds and the infrared light to pass, much like the color infrared. But also it has a second pass in the blues that allows us to capture blues. And the benefit of this is that by capturing the two passes, we can actually get really interesting colors without having to do color swapping in post-production. So a lot of people like chrome because it mimics aerochrome and it has less post-production processing required. But you will need to do a camera conversion in order to shoot in chrome. And then finally, we have ultraviolet images, and these capture ultraviolet light only, so no visible light or no infrared light. You'll need a full spectrum camera and then an external UV low pass filter. So that's different from the typical UV filters you'll encounter, which are designed to block infrared light. A UV low pass filter allows the UV light to pass and then blocks all of the visible light. So UV is interesting because it displays skin pigmentation, which is not readily visible to the human eye. It can also produce interesting effects with some subjects, such as flowers, which are popular. So UV, of course, is not technically infrared photography, but they're kind of related because they both use converted cameras and they both use filters. So we kind of collectively talk about it in the same vein as infrared because they use a lot of the similar techniques. So let's talk about the equipment that you need to shoot infrared. So there's two mediums that we have. Of course, we have film and we have digital. I'll briefly talk about film, but I'll probably spend more time on digital. So with film, we have color film and black and white film. Unfortunately, the color infrared film is no longer manufactured. The Kodak Aerochrome, the most popular color infrared film, was discontinued in 2009. It's still available on eBay for $125 a roll, if you're interested. There's been other smaller runs of different manufacturers that have made color infrared films, but unfortunately they've all been discontinued as well. But if you like the images from the aerochrome style, then a converted digital camera with a chrome style filter is definitely the way to go. If you'd still like to shoot infrared film, black and white infrared films are still available. So a commonly available black and white film is the Rollei Infrared 400. This film captures both visible and infrared light. So without a filter, it will result in probably a pretty standard looking black and white image. However, if you use it with a 720 nanometer filter, then you can block a lot of the visible light and capture only infrared light. But when you do this, it'll kind of act as an ND filter, and you'll have to adjust about 4 to 5 stops when shooting. So that's something to take into account. But it's actually a really fun film to shoot with, and you can see an example here of probably a familiar subject to some, and the difference of what it looks like in visible light and what it looks like in infrared. So broadly speaking, there are two options for shooting digital infrared. So we have the unconverted camera. So this is your standard digital camera, and you take this camera and you'll apply one of these filters, 720 nanometer or greater lens filter. And using an unconverted camera, you can cover 3 of the styles that we talked about. You can cover the traditional infrared style, which gets a little bit of visible light, the deep infrared, which is infrared only, and then the black and white styles. So that's what you can do with an unconverted camera. If you're willing to convert a camera, then you can shoot with the converted camera, and you can choose to shoot it as you've converted it, or you can add additional external lenses as well. And the benefits, some of the benefits of shooting with a converted camera are you get access to the additional styles. So you can shoot in color infrared, chrome, full spectrum, and even ultraviolet. The downside is that there's a little bit more cost involved because you have to convert a camera. And of course, if you start to buy external filters, then those could add cost as well. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. So we'll start with an unconverted camera. So what do you need what equipment do you need? What are the pros of shooting unconverted? What are the cons? And how do you shoot and edit with an unconverted camera, which is what most people will start with on their infrared journey. So with an unconverted camera, you can work with just about any DSLR or mirrorless digital camera. So mirrorless tends to be a little bit better because they tend to have better focusing and focus support systems like focus assist and focus peaking. With DSLRs, you can certainly shoot infrared with DSLRs. My first converted camera was a DSLR, but the challenge with DSLRs is the focusing. So the focus, when you shoot in infrared, the focusing is different for infrared light compared to visible light. And the challenge here becomes that if you use, say, if you manually focus with the focus marks on your lens, or if you use a through the viewfinder on a DSLR, then the focusing will be inaccurate because it's that focusing system that goes up to, it bounces off the mirror and hits off of another mirror and reflects some of the light to the viewfinder and some of it to the focusing mechanism, is calibrated for visible light. And so the result will be out of focus images. So if you're going to use a DSLR, then it's important that you use the live view screen on the back of a camera to set your focusing. You may be able to autofocus with the live view, but in all likelihood, you'll probably need to manual focus. As I said, you don't want to trust the focus markings, and you can zoom into focus or use focus peaking, and that can certainly help. So you're going to need an infrared filter, of course. So the 720 variety, the standard infrared filter, is what you'll need. I recommend one of the higher quality filters if you're shooting with an unconverted camera. So that's the Hoya R72. That's very popular. The Kolari Vision Standard IR, Life Pixel Standard IR, or the Tiffen number 87. And these are all good quality filters that it's important to use a high quality filter because you're going to end up with longer exposures, and you'll need a lower quality filter could show some of its artifacts or some of its challenges in a longer exposure. And so when you get to converted cameras, it's actually easier to use the lower quality filters because your exposure times are much faster. But when you're shooting with an unconverted camera, it's better to stick to a good quality filter. And frankly, you probably have a lot of the equipment already, so this may be the biggest expense that you have. The filter, of course, is going to have to match your lenses, and so you're going to want to match the lens size or get a larger filter and use step-up rings, which is something that I use frequently. One of the biggest challenges with infrared photography is the lenses. So some lenses, in fact, a lot of lenses, will produce what are called hotspots. And hotspots are these bright images that appear right in the center of the image. So like right there on the tree trunk. And unfortunately, it's a pretty widespread issue. Most lenses are calibrated and designed for visible light. They're not designed for shooting in infrared. And so some coincidentally will have this issue. So it's important when you're going to shoot infrared that you know if your lens will produce a hotspot or not. And so you can do your research. I've got a link here with lists of a variety of sources where you can research. So there's no one easy answer, buy this lens and you're all set. Because obviously with all the different manufacturers of cameras and all the different lenses available, it's a huge variety. And even these lists are nowhere near comprehensive. You're not going to find every lens manufactured covered. It's really, people like myself and others who are testing lenses and then publishing the results on the internet to see if they're suitable. A couple things to keep in mind, though, is that in general, prime lenses tend to have fewer hotspots than zooms. Vintage lenses tend to be way better at having no hotspots compared to modern lenses. In fact, I've started to buy a large number of vintage lenses because, of course, they're extremely affordable and they work excellent in infrared, and they tend not to have hotspots. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that wider apertures, those lower f-stop numbers, will tend to produce dimmer or no hotspots compared to the narrower or larger f numbers. So I even have some lenses that do have hot spots, but if you open up wide enough, then you can actually avoid them, and so you can be aware of that. So this is definitely one of the pitfalls, the gotchas of infrared photography, is making sure that you have the right lens. Because if you do a lot of shooting with a lens with a hot spot, it's really challenging to try to remove or fix the hot spots. I do have a video that I kind of covered the detail of trying to fix hot spots, but it's still a little messy. Your best bet is to try to avoid it if you can. Do some tests to make sure you have the appropriate lens. So of course, for unconverted, you're going to need a tripod because you're going to have a longer exposure because of that infrared filter in front of the lens. And then you're going to need some kind of a trigger, so that could, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So typically when you're shooting with say a 720 nanometer filter on an unconverted camera in broad daylight, you're probably looking at somewhere between 5 and 30 seconds is what your typical exposure would be. If you'd shoot deep infrared with a 800, 820, 850 nanometer filter, then you're really getting up into the 5 to 10 minute territory, which produces some additional challenges. But if you're shooting with a 720 filter, you're typically looking at about 5 to 30 seconds of an exposure. Yep. So because of that, you're going to want to have some kind of a trigger. So that could be a cable release, that could be remote control from your phone, it could be the self timer in the camera, that 2-second, 10-second timer. So those work well as well, whichever you prefer. But you'll probably want something. You don't want to be touching the camera to activate the trigger. So what are some of the pros of working with an unconverted camera? Well, it's easy to get started. It's affordable. I mean, this is still photography, so it's not like, there's still going to be some cost involved, right? But compared to, say, a conversion, it's affordable. You probably have all the equipment already that you need. You may just need that infrared lens filter. In fact, my first infrared, my first Hoya R72 I bought used, and I got it for about half the price of what you'd pay new for it. So it was actually pretty affordable. When you're working with shooting in an unconverted style, you don't have to make permanent changes to your camera. You have access to a number of the shooting styles for infrared. So you have the traditional, you have the deep infrared, and the black and white. These are, of course, the more muted styles from a color perspective. This is great for long exposures. So if you're already looking to blur water or clouds, you're going to get that 15 to 30 second exposure, and then that's you're right up your alley. And you can actually shoot great infrared images with an unconverted camera. I have shot a lot of images that I'm extremely happy with. So while I definitely probably shoot more with converted cameras, this is a great way to get started, and lots of great things you can do with an unconverted camera. So let's talk about some of the negatives. So of course you're going to have those longer exposures. So you're going to need a tripod. You're going to need a way to trigger the shot. You have to be aware of your subjects. So if you want your subjects to blur, that's fine. But if you don't want them to blur, then this technique might not work really well. And then you're limited in what you could shoot. So you won't be able to shoot some of these more colorful styles like the color infrared, chrome, full spectrum, or the ultraviolet. So those are some of the limitations of working with an unconverted camera. Basically, probably the camera you already have now. So coming up, I'll show you how to shoot and edit with an unconverted camera. But before we get into that, let's first talk about what it looks like to convert a camera for infrared and why you might want to do that. So converting a camera is something to consider when you're ready to go to the next level. So you'll get access to all the different styles. You can shoot with fast exposures. And what I mean by that is that it's just like shooting with visible light with a regular camera. So you can shoot, 500th of a second or 250th of a second. So you could shoot handheld. So it's very convenient. I'll do a lot of say hiking and traveling without a tripod using a converted camera, and I can use very fast exposures and get great results. So that's one of the benefits of shooting with a converted camera. So there's a number of considerations when you want to convert a camera. Of course, you have to select the camera to convert. And that comes with a whole array of questions that you'll have to ask yourself. I actually have a video dedicated to that topic of how to pick a camera to convert. So you might want to check that out if you're interested. Due to those faster shutter speeds, you won't need a tripod. You could still use one if you choose. And the other benefit of a converted camera is you can use lens filters to refine what you're shooting. So if you have a full spectrum converted camera, you could put any kind of a filter on it to get any of those styles and get those. Even if you have a converted camera that's a particular style, like let's say I have a camera that I converted to a 590 nanometer filter, I can put filters of a higher numbered nanometer cutoff. So I could put a 720 external filter on that. I could put an 850 on that, and then that I can shoot multiple styles with a camera that was converted to, say, a 590. So using external filters, you can extend the capabilities of even what your camera was converted to. And then, of course, you're probably going to want some step-up rings if you're using multiple lenses. If you're using a single lens, then just buy those filters that will match the lens that works best for you. So unfortunately, though, even if you've converted a camera, you still have to deal with hotspots. They haven't gone anywhere. So it's pretty much the same issue. You've got the same problems. Still, half of all lenses will have hotspots. You're going to want to do your research, and the same kind of rules apply. Primes are better than zooms. Vintage is better than modern, and the wider apertures tend to be better. So do your research in either case with your lenses. I kind of have a database of lenses as well, and then in my lens caps, I actually put like a label on my lens caps that shows I put whether it's infrared or not. So like half my lenses are infrared and half are not infrared, and I don't have to remember. I can just look at the label and go, oh yeah, that one's good for infrared. So yeah, sure. Yes. Oh yeah, and that's not, you haven't even gotten to the worst of it yet. So and again, this is only certain lenses. Like I have lenses that are good at all apertures, and so that's something you want to strive for. But focusing is a challenge. You may have to go with wider apertures for some, and also, and we'll get to this coming up, but I'll talk about it briefly here. Is diffraction is another issue, because diffraction actually kicks in earlier for infrared than it does for visible light. So that kind of even compresses the range of apertures you can use even further. So that's another thing to be aware of. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Yep. So when you converting a camera, there's two ways to do it. You can send it off to have it done professionally, or you can do it yourself. Do it yourself is great if you have great hand-eye coordination, a bunch of micro tools, are good with soldering, and don't mind destroying a camera. Then great, do it yourself. You can buy all the filters online and do it yourself. But if you're not into that and you don't want to risk destroying a camera, then there's a number of companies you can use to professionally convert a camera. I have used Kolari Vision and LifePixel, both in the US. There are other companies that will do these conversions. There's other companies in the US and in various places around the world. So lots of great options for having cameras converted. And typically the prices are all pretty close for what's available there. So let's talk about the benefits of shooting with a converted camera. So you're going to get access to all of those infrared styles. Shooting with a full spectrum camera allows for any style. So, you really have, sometimes it's hard to know what your interests are going to be before you get into infrared. You might find yourself, gravitating towards a particular style. And in that case, maybe you just convert a camera directly to that style. But if you want to experiment and try a lot of styles, then full spectrum really opens that up. It means you're going to have to spend more money on lens filters, but it really opens up the possibilities for what you can do with a full spectrum camera. So the short exposures are great because you can handheld everything. You don't need to worry about a tripod. And of course, you could shoot, just like with an unconverted camera, you could shoot really great images. So lots of possibilities there. So there are some negatives with converting a camera. It's permanent. It's pretty much a permanent change to the camera. You kind of have to dedicate a camera to it. It's a commitment. So typically people will they'll maybe use an older camera that used to be their main camera, or maybe buy a used camera. So there's a variety of things, a variety of ways that you can go for selecting a camera to use. I would say rarely do people make it their primary camera. They might still keep a camera for visible light, boring old visible light. You're going to avoid the warranty because you're going to have to take that thing apart, or the professionals are going to have to take that apart. And there's going to be a cost to it, of course. Now, if you want to shoot long exposures, you're going to have to add an ND filter because the exposures are so fast. So if you like the long exposures, then you might want to give Unconverted a try first. And then, of course, all of this can add up in a cost factor. Again, nothing new for photography, but you just kind of got to be aware of gas. I find myself, ooh, do I want to convert another camera, and what do I want to convert it to, and do I want to buy more filters, and what size do they be, and step up rings, and it can easily kind of spiral out of control. So definitely something to be cautious about. So let's talk about how we shoot infrared with your existing camera. So this would be like an unconverted camera, a camera that you already have. So first, let's talk about when you want to be shooting. So you've probably heard for photography things like, the golden hour, and it's all about the light and stuff, and these kind of things. And that's it being about the light is definitely true for infrared, but infrared is very different in that infrared likes sun. It likes full blast, midday, harsh sunlight. Probably the kind that you've been taught makes for bad photography. It's actually perfect for infrared. Cloudy days, not as good. Shaded conditions, not as good. You'll get less contrast in your image, and really you want to avoid the golden hour. If you start to get maybe even within an hour of the golden hour, the quality of light for infrared and the contrast is just going to plummet. So you really want that that midday light. And actually, that's almost kind of how I got into infrared. Is I kept finding myself in situations where I was out in the middle of the day, and I wanted to shoot, but you're always told don't shoot in the middle of the day. And then I kind of discovered infrared. I'm like, oh, this is a great way for me to shoot in the middle of the day. So that's kind of how I got into it originally. So to shoot with this unconverted style, you're going to need a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. In this example that I'm going to show you, I'm using a Fujifilm X-T2, which is like a 5-year-old APS-C camera. The lens that I'm using is a Fujinon 14mm f2.8. This is one of my favorite lenses because it's wide angle, it has no hotspots, it's any aperture. But like I said, vintage lenses are really great as well. So I really like working with vintage lenses. So I've got a tripod and I've got a cable release, which is, entirely unnecessary. I could have used a self-timer, but I really like sometimes how using a cable release kind of forces me to slow down and think about what I'm doing. And then, of course, I have the Hoya R72 lens filter, which is the kind of the standard of 720 nanometer lens filters. So the first thing that I want to do is set up my camera and my tripod, and then I want to compose the shot, but I want to do that before I put the filter on. Once you put the filter on, it's going to be a little bit harder to see what you're doing, and so you definitely want to try to compose your shot first before adding that filter. So the next thing that I want to do is set my ISO. Now, because we're shooting in broad daylight, it's usually easy to go with your base ISO for the best quality. So in my case, for this camera, it's ISO 200. For your camera, it might be 100 or 50, but you typically can go with the lowest ISO available for your camera. For shutter speed, I typically just set to automatic or use aperture priority and let the camera figure it out, although you're certainly welcome to shoot manually. Your histogram should work fine in infrared, so if you're comfortable working manually, you can set your histogram to make sure you're not clipping on either side. Now for the aperture, this gets into the diffraction issue that I talked about earlier. So typically what I recommend is using one stop lower than your preferred f-stop for landscape. So if you know your lens well and you've shot a lot of landscapes and you know what the f-stop is before diffraction kicks in, then you're going to want to go one number lower than that, because of the fact that diffraction will start earlier in infrared than in visible light. If you want to see the evidence, I've got a full video that covers that. It's kind of well, I mean, if you're into the sciencey, nerdy stuff, I guess it's an interesting subject. It was for me, but you can get all the details there. But if you're not interested in that, then what I would say is use one stop lower than what you're used to, or if you don't know, then another safe method is to just use 3 stops wider than the lens's narrowest aperture or the highest number. So, for example, in this case, if the highest value is f22, then 3 stops wider would be 16, 11, 8. So then you'd use f8. So if you want to learn more about diffraction in infrared, then definitely check out that separate video. So after you've composed the shot and then made all of your adjustments to settings, now you can actually add the infrared filter to the lens. And with that on, the image is going to appear really red. So the image on the left is what it normally will look like in camera, so that very stark red. And then the image on the right is what it will look like after processing. So it's going to be very different. So don't panic if the image you're looking at is extremely red. That's typical. So next up, let's talk a little bit about white balance. So white balance is another one of these tricky pitfall subject areas in infrared, especially with an unconverted camera. So many photographers who are getting started in infrared will get stuck when it comes to white balance. I've talked about white balance in nearly every video that I've made, and I've actually made 2 videos dedicated just completely to talking about white balance because it's that much of a kind of a gotcha subject. So certainly I'll talk about it a little bit here, but definitely check out some of those if you're interested in learning more. For the case of this tutorial, what I would recommend is just shooting in RAW. So RAW will give you full control of the white balance while you're editing. And this is really important for infrared, to have that level of control. Once you've developed some skills with infrared, if you're comfortable setting a custom white balance in camera in the field, feel free to do that. But until you get that comfort level, then stick to RAW. That's going to give you the best results, and it'll give you that complete control of the white balance in post-production. So definitely RAW is a great option. So the other thing to be aware of when you're shooting is that autofocus might not work on your camera. So of course, don't use the viewfinder if you're shooting with a DSLR, because the focus will be wrong. Use live view, manual focusing, and then use the focus assist. So it's called different things on different cameras, but it's that feature that allows you to, like a digital zoom, to zoom in, punch in 5 or 10 times and see up close. That'll help you to focus. The other thing that I really like is if your camera supports focus peaking, sometimes some cameras will allow you to set the color of the focus peaking. And typically that color is like a white or a red. But if your camera supports blue, that's actually really nice because the blue contrasts really well with what you're seeing. And so a blue focus peaking can really help you to set a manual focus. So then the next thing you do is take the shot. So again, in the camera, it's going to look very red, and that's normal. This is what it'll look like in camera, but we'll fix that when we get to processing. Okay, so let's talk about how to process infrared images. So this is another one of those tricky areas that tends to catch people up. So what I'm going to cover is basically the process for traditional infrared or color infrared shots. There's some one-time steps that are involved to create a custom profile. It's not super involved, it's not too bad, but you only need to do it once for your camera. And once you've done it once for your camera, you can use it for all of your infrared images. So it's definitely worth doing. And then once you've done that, then all you need to do is apply that filter. That'll help you set the white balance. Because again, white balance is an issue. We'll swap the colors, and then you can edit to taste. So that's the high level view of it. Let's walk through some of the individual steps. So the first thing you're going to need is in order to create a profile, you're going to need a DNG file that will be from the same camera. So if you already convert your raw files to DNG in Lightroom, then you've already got DNGs. You can just skip this step. But otherwise, you've got a couple different choices for creating a DNG file. You can either do it in Lightroom by under Library selecting Convert Photo to DNG, or you can download Adobe's free DNG converter. And what this tool does is it basically takes in a raw file and just outputs a DNG file. And you only need to do this with a single image because we just needed the one image to create a profile, and then from that point on, it will work with all of your images. Okay, so once we've done that, now we get another free tool from Adobe, and this is the Adobe DNG Color Profile Editor. And so what this tool does is this allows you to create custom profiles for Lightroom and Photoshop. And this is really important. And I'll explain a little bit more once we get into Photoshop, but basically there are limits in Photoshop's capabilities of dealing with a range of white balance, and we're gonna deal with that limit right now by making this profile, so we don't have to worry about that. Some other programs that you might use don't need a custom profile. So if you're into Darktable, or if you're into other editors like On1, or maybe even Capture One, they don't necessarily need a profile. But if you're using Lightroom or Photoshop, then this is definitely the way to go. You'll want to create one of these profiles. So the first thing we do is we open up the DNG file that we created or that we converted. And we're going to go to the Color Matrices tab. So that's our first step. And then once we're on Color Matrices, there's a section down at the bottom called White Balance Calibration. And we're going to want to find a temperature slider. And we'll take that temperature slider and we're going to move that all the way to -100. Just going to kick that all the way over. That'll help get us the range that we need. And then once we're done there, we can select File and Export. Now, saving the profile to the correct location can be a little bit tricky because it's in a hidden directory and it's different for Windows versus Mac. So I've got the file locations here on screen. I've also got the paths and the instructions on my website if that's easier, because this is one of those tricky things. I've got some stuff there, instructions that'll help you get to the hidden directories and whatnot. So that might be worth a consideration. So it's a little bit tricky to get it, but once you get it in the right place, then you're good to go. So now that we have this custom profile, now we're actually ready to edit the image that we shot in infrared within Photoshop. So we're going to open this up. It'll open up in Camera Raw. And you don't need, this could be a raw file or it could be a DNG. It doesn't matter at this point. We just needed that DNG to create the profile. So now at this point, we can shoot raw files or DNG files. It doesn't matter. So when we first open up the image, just like in camera, it's going to appear very red. Now, when you try to set a custom white balance, in this case, I'll try to set a white balance on the granite, you'll notice that the value of the temperature slider is all the way down at the bottom at 2000 Kelvin. And with other infrared images, you may actually find that it caps out in the other direction at 50,000 Kelvin. So this is a problem because we need the white balance to go farther. And this is why we need that custom profile with Lightroom and Photoshop to give us that extra range that we need. So what we're going to do is select the Browse Profiles icon to see all of the profiles that are available. Now, if we save the file in the right location, and this is something that can catch a lot of people, then under the Profiles group, we can look for the custom profile that we created. It'll appear here, whatever we named it, the one we created with the DNG profile editor. So in this case, I marked it as a favorite, so it's also appearing in my favorites group, which makes it easier for me to find. So I'm going to select this custom profile. And when I do that, the colors change dramatically. Like, oh, they're off in a crazy direction now. Everything's a bit wonky. And that's okay, because remember, I had a crazy white balance set. Now that we've got the right profile, now we can go back and revisit the white balance. This is why these profiles are so important. They really help us with white balance. So we're going to go under the basic panel. And we're going to go to the white balance tool and select it. Now we need to pick a neutral subject. And in this case, neutral can be white, it could be gray, it could be even green, because remember, everything that's green in visible light is going to be white in infrared. So in this case, I just happen to have a 3,000 foot tall gray card handy that I can white balance on. So I will click on that. And now once I've done that, thanks to my custom profile, now I have a white balance that actually falls within the range of the temperature. So in this case, it says it's about 3050 Kelvin. And the actual value is not relevant. People will frequently say, oh, what's the perfect, white balance for infrared? And the reality is that this is very different than visible light. In visible light, you're trying to pick a white balance that matches the lighting conditions so that things look natural to the human eye. Infrared photography is a very creative form of photography. And so there's no right answer that says, oh, that this setting of white balance produces the best results. It's going to be different depending on your camera, depending on the settings you had, the filter you use. There's all kinds of variables. So I can't say that, oh, this one color temperature value is going to be the right one for everybody. That's not the case. This is why I really advocate for white balance, that people use their selector to select something neutral in the image to find that value, because there is no one right value. And once you've selected the right value, then you're going to have something like this, where the sky is kind of a soft yellow, the trees and the granite are white with maybe a hint of blue, and this is exactly what we want. So now at this point, you can make any of the adjustments that you'd like in Camera Raw. So any of the sort of typical adjustments that you make. The thing that I most commonly do with an infrared images is add some contrast, because when we're what we don't realize in visible light photography is that a lot of the color variation that we have gives us much of the contrast we need. And when we're capturing a more compressed range of wavelengths, we're not going to get as much contrast. So we want to add a little bit back of that in, subject to your taste, of course. So I will typically use contrast, or the clarity slider, or curves, or maybe even a little bit of dehaze. Okay. So after some of those basic adjustments, then what I'll do is I'll open the object in Photoshop as a smart object. And the reason I like opening it as a smart object is because it allows me to come back into Camera Raw later and tweak some of these values if I want to do that. So once I've opened up the image in Photoshop, now the next thing I want to do is to swap the colors. So in Photoshop, what you'll do is select the Layers panel, and you can also open layers from the Windows menu above if you don't already have it open. Then at the bottom of the Layers panel, you can look for the Adjustment Layer icon. And clicking that opens up this menu of adjustment layers. And what you'll want to do is select Channel Mixer. Channel Mixer is the one that gives us the ability to swap the colors for our infrared photos. Now, in the Channel Mixer, what we want to do is go to the Properties. We want to select the red output channel, and we want to set red to 0. We don't want red to be red. We want red to be blue. So we're going to set the blue to 100%. So in red, this will convert red colors to blue. Then we want to select the blue output channel, and we can click red and set red to 100, and then set blue to 0. So I've also created a free set of Photoshop actions that you can use to automate this process. If you find yourself processing a lot of infrared images and doing this process a lot, it's much easier to run these actions and to automatically do your channel mixing for you. So try to simplify the process a little bit. So after you've swapped out the red and blue channels, now this is the image that we have. And so this covers the basic steps. But from here, you can do a variety of things. You can double click the image in the layer to return to camera raw. You can make additional adjustments. Maybe you want a different contrast or some of the other basic adjustments you want. You can make any other changes you would do in Photoshop. You can make those here. Frequently, what I will do is I will add a hue and saturation adjustment layer because I want to tweak the colors a bit. You can keep the colors as they are at this point, but I prefer to play with them a little bit. So, for example, I've applied a hue saturation adjustment layer, and in this case, I've desaturated the foliage color a little bit, and I've turned the hue to a little bit more of an orange or yellow color. I can also take the sky and make that teal to a natural blue. There's a lot of possibilities here. In the color work that I do, sometimes I really like, say, a teal sky. It gives me that, otherworldly feel. Or sometimes I get really crazy with the colors. So it's a completely creative endeavor, and how you want your images to be colored is entirely up to you. Even color swapping, this channel mixer color swapping process is completely optional. If you like the way that the images look before a color swap, then that's a great way to go as well. So lots of creativity, lots of choices available for you in the editing process. So your next steps are to go get yourself an infrared filter and start shooting. So I've got a variety of resources available for you to learn more. If you check out my YouTube channel, I think I'm actually up to about 60 videos now that cover all kinds of different stuff that you see listed here. So how to convert cameras, how to shooting, editing. I've looked at maybe a dozen different editors to see if they're suitable for editing infrared. Of course, white balance. I've reviewed various filters, infrared filters, various lenses, vintage lenses, different cameras, and then talked about some of the technical aspects and some of the pitfalls that you deal with infrared. So things like hotspots and diffusion and focus to try to deal with some of these things. And then, of course, I also have a blog which contains more of a written long form version of many of these videos. Sometimes that's easier to follow if it's a complex list of instructions that you have to walk through. Like, for example, we earlier talked about, before we started, about LUTs. I've got a very complicated process of how to what you could do with a LUT and why that would be helpful to you. And so that sometimes is easier for people to follow in written form than a video. So lots of options here to check out if you're interested in learning more about infrared. So that's what I've got for you today. So now I want to open up the floor for questions. Mm-hmm. Yep. So the question is, if you have a full spectrum camera and you add filters, is that going to affect your exposure? So the first thing to keep in mind is that if you have a full spectrum camera without filters, you're actually capturing more light than you would with the standard hot mirror. So you may actually need shorter exposures even. With various external filters, they will reduce the amount of light being captured, and so technically result in a longer exposure. But with a full spectrum camera, or really with any converted camera, it's not by much. You still can get a pretty full, a pretty sort of typical exposure that you'd see with a visible light shot. The only exception is going to be when you start to add a very high numbered cutoff, like say an 850 nanometer or even a 950 nanometer, because then the amount of light you're capturing is reduced greatly, and so you'll see a little bit longer of an exposure. But still, it's going to be nowhere near, we're still talking, fractions of a second. With an 850 or a 950, you might be starting to look at maybe a 30th of a second or a 20th of a second. You're still nowhere near the long exposures that you're going to see with an unconverted camera. Yeah. Right. No, this was just, just trying to, I can't boil the ocean here in, in an hour. But I'll cover that. So the negative 100, I find in general works really well for the lower numbered filters. So typically your 470, 590, 665 kind of thing is where the negative 100 color temperature profile works really well. I've found that if you're shooting 720 nanometer, or if you're shooting a 590 and you happen to shoot in the shade, like one time I was in, a national park, and it was raining and it was dark and it was morning, and I was trying to shoot infrared and there was no contrast, no color, but a negative 50 profile actually helps a little bit. So that negative 50 profile I think is really good for if you shoot 720, or if you shoot with a lower number like a 590, but you end up with some lower contrast because of cloud cover, less sunlight, shade, etc. I've tried a whole bunch of other varieties. I've tried negative 25, negative 75, other variations in the DNG editor, and really I always come back to negative 50 and negative 100 are really the only two I end up needing. Yep. Right. Right. That's a great question. So the question is, when I take off the hot mirror on a camera to get to the full sensor, does that have any impact on the individual pixels? And namely, like the 4 colored pixels you'd get in a Bayer array, or the 9 pixels that you'd get in an X-trans sensor. So I was actually really curious about that, and I didn't make a video on this, but I did quite a deep dive into trying to learn about pixel and subpixel processing, especially when I was researching diffusion, because I was like, the question that I had was at the time was, is there a difference in diffusion between a Bayer sensor and an X-trans sensor, because one of them is a 4 pixel and one of them is a 9 pixel. And the thing that I discovered is that when you look at, say, a Bayer filter and it's got those 4 pixels, your camera, let's say your camera has 6,000 by 4,000 pixels, right? And you think to yourself, well, if there's a 4 pixel grid, how does that work, right? How do I get? Are you dividing that 4 by 6,000 by 4 pixels? And the answer is no. That you still only have that many pixels. But what happens in the aliasing is that this is where processing comes into play, and each one of those pixels looks at neighboring pixels to decide what color it should be. So in the Bayer sense, it's predominantly looking at that pixel and the pixels directly around it, and maybe slightly farther away. And in the X-trans sensor, it's got a little bit more to work with. But basically, you're not really getting more light. In reality, you have some of your sensors aren't doing as much. Some of your pixels aren't doing as much, is what it kind of comes down to. Because if you're shooting full spectrum, you'd catch it all. But let's say you're shooting with maybe a 590 nanometer or higher, you're not capturing any blues, you're not capturing any greens, you're only going to get the reds. So on a Bayer sensor, you're only going to hit one of the 4 pixels, and so you might think that that's going to mean less of an exposure. It's really not as much of an impact as you'd think. But I was kind of hoping that I'd find some magic solution that said, aha, this kind of sensor, or maybe a fovean sensor, was going to be the magic solution for infrared. And unfortunately, I didn't find that any of them was dramatically better than the others, because of the way that the aliasing works to sort of rebuild colors from a computational standpoint. That was the other thing that would kind of enlighten me to realize that, there's been this talk lately about computational photography. But if you think about it, all digital cameras are computational photography, because they all have to basically guess at the color that a pixel has, because no single pixel is capturing the full spectrum of color. It's only capturing red, green, or blue. and it's got to guess at the rest of them. So basically, all digital photography is computational photography. So, how does the temperature of the camera body affect pictures? So, I would say that with a converted camera, um, let me take a step back first. Let me say if you had a camera with light leaks, like in the case of a film camera, then obviously that could have an impact. In the case of digital cameras, I would say that the temperature of the camera is unlikely to affect the image on a converted camera. However, if you deal with one case that I've seen is, and I've actually might even be my next video, is when you're working with deep infrared, so that's like a 750, 800 nanometer filter or higher, and you're using an unconverted camera, and you're getting those really long 5-10 minute exposures, that's where the heat of the camera could have an impact. I don't know that that's where I think it has the potential to have an impact. Probably the bigger impact is going to be hot pixels, like individual pixels that overheat, and you really start to see hot pixels when you get to that 5 minute, even 3 to 5 minute mark for an exposure. Hot pixels can kind of come through. So I've seen that in the longer exposures, but I haven't yet noticed anything that I could attribute to the body heat of the camera itself having an impact on the images. Okay. Light painting, yeah, absolutely. So what I would recommend if you wanted to do light painting in infrared is that you get an infrared light. So you've got a couple choices there. You can get there's infrared lights available on Amazon, infrared like lamps, infrared flashlights. If you go to Kolari Vision, one of those infrared conversion companies that I talked about, they sell a couple interesting products. They have like a handheld flashlight that will shine infrared light only, and that could be used for light painting. And they also sell a regular shoe-mounted flash, kind of like the standard flash you'd put on like a Canon or Nikon camera. That they then have like almost like filters, but they're covers for that prevent light leaks that will only allow either infrared or ultraviolet light to be emitted. So it's basically like an infrared or an ultraviolet flash that you could put on your camera. So those are a couple choices that you could use to do to use light painting. If you're going to do light painting, of course, your best bets are going to be either to do an unconverted camera to get the long exposures, or some of these conversion companies are starting to use the ND filters. Are starting to offer ND filters that are calibrated for infrared light. So, for example, Kolari Vision has some ND filters that are explicitly calibrated for infrared, so that if you want to take, say, a converted camera that's already converted, which would have a very short shutter speeds, and you wanted to have longer shutter speeds in order to do light painting, you could use one of their infrared, one of their neutral density filters, and that wouldn't contaminate the colors of the infrared as much. So a couple things to think about there is how you get the longer exposures, and then of course you can use those infrared lights or flashlights to do the painting itself. So when you convert a camera, and the question is, when you convert a camera, is the sensor removed or replaced? So when you convert a camera, the sensor itself is not touched. The sensor itself remains. So you have your original sensor. What's removed is every digital camera has a filter that appears in front of it. It's actually kind of a greenish tint if you look at it, and that is the hot mirror filter. That comes in front of every sensor, and you may, if you take the lens off your camera, you might not be able to see that it's green because, of course, the sensor's behind it. You may not even realize it's there because it's, of course, the exact same shape as the sensor. But in a converted camera, that that hot mirror filter is removed, and it's typically a square, the exact same size as your sensor, and it's replaced with one of two options. Either it's replaced with a clear filter when you want to do a full spectrum conversion, or it's replaced with a specific cutoff filter. So for example, I have a camera that's converted to 590 nanometers. So they pulled off the hot mirror, they replaced it with a filter mounted right on the sensor that will do 590 nanometers. And now that's permanent for that camera. That's the way that works. But the sensor itself is not changed. The only thing that happens is in some camera models, when you do a conversion, a lot of modern cameras will do a dust removal system, and what that basically is it's something that kind of shakes the sensor when you turn the camera off. You may see a message on the back of your screen, that cleaning sensor, and so basically what's happening is your sensor does a little bit shake to shake the dust off, and in some camera systems, when you do a conversion, that has to be disabled. But I don't know that applies to all cameras. It might only apply to some, but definitely you're going to have the same sensor that came with your original camera. It's just that filter in front that's getting changed. Yes, you can clean the sensor after you do a conversion. In fact, I've found that I had to do it more often. So, I get those little swabs that are the size of your sensor and clean those off. I've gotten way too good at doing dust removal in post-processing. So I find that I probably find that I have to clean the sensors on my infrared camera more often than my visible light camera. And I'm not really sure if that's because it attracts more dust. I suspect it's probably because I changed the lenses more, so I'm just introducing more dust in there. But yeah, I definitely do have to clean the sensor there. Okay. I have not myself, but I've definitely researched it. So I know you have the IR sensors, which are very affordable for the Raspberry Pis, and also Raspberry Pi actually comes with a infrared camera that, in addition to the visible light camera, one of their early models that you can use. So you could build a camera that both detects infrared, like heat, motion, and then actually takes shots in infrared, which could be useful. So I've definitely read about it. It's on my list of things to try. I just haven't gotten to it yet. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Right. Yep. Sure. So, first of all, I would say, I wouldn't be thrown off too much by a smaller resolution sensor, from an older camera. That wouldn't throw me that much. Um, I wouldn't be, if you had a 10 megabit or 10 megapixel or a 12 or 16. Like most of my shots are actually with a 16 megapixel, so that doesn't bother me. The thing you probably want to be more aware of when thinking about converting an older camera is the focusing mechanism. So you're going to have to be more careful with DSLRs. The older DSLRs, you're going to have to make sure they have live view and that you can get a good view on the screen. And the challenge is going to be that focusing. So you may get better, you're definitely going to get better results with a mirrorless camera. You're probably going to get better results with a newer DSLR. You're going to get, more likely to have focus peaking and other kind of capabilities. But those are going to be, I think, a bigger factor than the sensor itself. So I would worry less about the size of the sensor, and I would worry more about the focusing system of some of those older cameras. Mm-hmm. Right. That is correct. That is correct. Obviously, I might do a a basic focus to make sure that I can see what I'm composing. But yes, the focus in visible light is different than the focus in infrared. So it's critical that you set your focus after you add the infrared filter. Otherwise, the focus will be wrong, and you'll be disappointed with the results. So you definitely want to focus afterwards. I mean, again, that is another benefit of a converted camera, is that because of the short exposures and the amount of light coming in, they basically act like a regular camera. You could shoot it. You could shoot. The autofocus works great, for example. On my, like, I have a Fujifilm X-T20 that I've converted, and that the I use autofocus all the time for that one, because again, you don't have to worry about the DSLR focusing. You're focusing directly off the sensor, so you know that you're going to get an accurate focus. And because the camera's already converted, I'm basically getting a focus of that infrared light that I want to capture. But yes, so in any case, you want to make sure that you're focusing after you put the infrared filter on, specifically for an unconverted camera, but even if you're adding a filter to a converted camera. Aerochrome. So aerochrome is a really unique beast, if you will, because if you think about, let me clarify. Are you asking about aerochrome, the film specifically, or are you asking about sort of the modern chrome style filters that are used on digital cameras? Okay, so the chrome style filter, that's the one that has a dual pass. So that's the one where it's basically has two openings that allow light to pass. One of them being that blue light. So you're going to be looking at. Let's see here. Let me go back and find this slide that's going to be relevant here. It'll help me to hone in on it. So basically, you'd be looking at something from about 400 and here's the thing. It's going to be about 470 nanometers to 520 nanometers. But the thing about this is that this is basically considered sort of, these chrome filters are considered sort of proprietary by the manufacturers. So they don't tell us the actual range. They tell us how to use them. And from the research I've done, I can infer that it's a dual pass filter that's allowing some blue to be captured and some orange or red plus infrared, but they don't release the specs because it's kind of a competitive marketplace right now. Because this is a popular style. It's a relatively new style of filter that's only a couple years old, and it's competitive. So we don't know the exact one. So, like, to give you an example, Kolari Vision has one called their Chrome filter, and LifePixel has a different one with a different name. And I think they're both the same concept of that sort of dual band of let's see here, that dual band where you're looking at some blue and some red, but we just don't know the exact values because they don't publish that information. Yes, that is correct. You need a full spectrum camera to use this filter, or you would need a camera that's converted directly to this filter type. If, for example, like I have a 590 nanometer converted camera, if I add this chrome filter to it, I basically won't get the blue because my internal filter is already cutting off everything below 590. So in order to get the full effect of this, you would need excuse me, certainly a full spectrum camera, maybe a camera converted with a 470 or higher filter. But again, that might be a bit of a risk because I don't know the exact values of what they're capturing. Mm-hmm. I have the question is about doing selecting colors in Photoshop and then using that to change colors. Um, and I found that it to be not as effective as the channel mixer. It can be very hard to get the selections right, super tricky. Whereas the channel mixer just flat out does it. My preferred method is to use the channel mixer if I desire that kind of effect, and then to use the hue saturation adjustment filter, because that gives me, then you have a couple choices. You can either, at a master level, you can either select all of the colors that are going to be impacted, or you can just select, let's see, I'm trying to get up to a shot that'll show it. Let's see here. Yeah, so here in this shot, you can see it might be kind of small, but basically in the hue saturation properties, there's where it says reds here, there's a drop down that'll say master for all colors, or you can pick from like 7 different colors. And sometimes I'll use the master to just do like a hue shift, but what I find super effective is to either pick one of those individual color channels, one of those 7, or use this little hand picker to pick a color off of my image. And then once I've picked that, then I will use the hue slider to then grab that around. And that does a really good job of picking a broad enough range that you're basically collecting everything and you don't have to worry about kind of missing everything in the selection. There's usually a broad enough difference between, say, your reds or your reds or your blues, that they're easily distinguished using the hue saturation filter. So that's pretty much the predominant tool that I will use in Photoshop for messing around with colors. So I have a question here that came in from my live stream. Let's see a couple of them. Asking about some vintage filters, the Soligor lenses, vintage lenses. How do I connect these with specific? Bought a 135 and a 35 millimeter, but cannot attach them. So yeah, let's see. The box says it's a fit to Canon, but I have a adapt to all. So that's and other adapters. So yeah, that might be a tricky one to answer because so I'll tell you what I've done with my vintage lenses. I have about 4 adapters. So I've picked up and of course, like I said, I'm shooting mostly Fuji these days, although I have converted Canon cameras in the past. So I have a Canon FD to Fuji adapter. I have a Nikon to Fuji adapter. That was actually a shift tilt adapter, so that's kind of interesting. And then, so I could kind of do shift tilt effects, even though the lens isn't shift tilt. So I've got a couple Nikon lenses I can do that with. Then I have a Minolta to Fuji adapter, and then a Pentax, the M42 threaded filter. But across those adapters, the shift tilt was a little more expensive, but those other adapters are typically like $15 or $13 on Amazon. And because they're just dumb filters, dumb adapters, they don't, you're not going to get any, of course, focusing or EXIF data, any kind of information. So they're very affordable, but they basically allow you to adapt a whole variety of these vintage lenses. So I basically, once I've picked up a number of those adapters, it gives me flexibility to buy a bunch of lenses. In fact, there's a camera show that I've gone to regularly in Hayward that where I bought a ton of vintage lenses. That's been a great, and most of them pretty affordably, like $50 or less. So that's a great option for picking those up. So definitely making sure you have the right adapter. I haven't bought any that have that Adaptall style. I've seen those at some of the camera shows, but I haven't bought any of those yet, so I don't have any specific experience with the Adaptall. I have another question here that was, I currently use a converted Nikon D810. I'm looking to see about converting one of my older Sony A7R2s, but I've heard these had some issues. Do you have any suggestions for the Sony Alphas and lenses? Unfortunately, no, I don't. I don't have specific experience with those. I've got a great deal of experience with Fuji and the Fuji lenses because that's what I predominantly shoot. But I do have resources that I link to on my website that link to all of the different resources that I've found for looking at different lenses. So you've got, of course, the big ones like Kolari Vision and LifePixel both have databases for lenses. There's a gentleman named Edward Noble who's done some fantastic work in testing lenses. He's got a great site. There's some forums that I've found that have other lenses listed. So there's a variety of these with these a variety of resources you can look at for finding these because it's just it's I have enough problems spending money on the camera gear as it is without crossing over and trying to cover all the brands. So let's see the question here. The follow-up comment on the adaptation was that the Solengor lenses without were more difficult to adapt. So yeah, that was challenging. I did a video on a couple Solengor lenses, the similar ones, the 35mm and the 135, but I think I bought those with maybe a Minolta mount, and so I just needed a Minolta adapter. So that was a little easier to deal with. Sure, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. The Sonys have a short flange distance. In general, the mirrorless cameras have a shorter flange distance. So you're looking at the Fuji and like Olympus, any of the mirrorless cameras, maybe even the newer like Canon and Nikon mirrorless cameras will have a shorter flange distance. The benefit of that shorter flange is that, of course, the old DSLR style or SLR style lenses even had a longer flange, and you can use that gap to adapt lenses. So when I was, like I've shown you, I've done a little bit of film, a little bit of infrared film, which I like, but of course it's definitely a lot harder than digital. But as kind of a middle ground between the two, I've really liked working with the vintage lenses. So you get those vintage SLR lenses that are designed for full frame cameras, full frame 35mm film cameras. You get those adapters to mount to any mirrorless cameras, and I think they're fantastic. So yeah, definitely great with Sony, Fuji, Olympus, or any mirrorless camera. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Mm-hmm. So what's worked for me, I have a bunch of modern Fuji lenses that are of course great and sharp and awesome. But what really worked for me was not taking them when I would go out somewhere. So I found that going out on a shoot and taking maybe two of the vintage lenses and maybe a couple different focal lengths, it forced me to use them. And it's interesting because, definitely they're not as sharp. They're not as sharp as the modern lenses, but they do have a really interesting character. And so that's one of the things. And some people, some people when they're working with infrared, they like to mimic the style of infrared film. So they like to, maybe add a little bit of glow, maybe even a little soft focus to kind of create that effect. But actually, you can kind of get a little bit of that with some of these vintage lenses. So I would recommend, yeah, they're not going to be as sharp as a modern lens, but every once in a while, go out on a shoot and take one with you without the modern lenses and see what you get. I like the style that they produce in infrared, so it's definitely a creative choice. Somebody in my YouTube chat talked about their Nikon and lenses were like carrying two bricks, and I can relate to that because I used to be a Canon shooter, and I had a ton of Canon gear. I had some great Canon glass, fantastic image quality. Converted a Canon camera to infrared, and then I started hiking and hiking up mountains. And I had this giant camera bag, and it was heavier than all get out. And I'm like, this is no more. So I did a bunch of research, and I basically decided to completely switch systems. And I did this. I tend to overanalyze things, but I looked at price and weight, and all these different image quality, all these different factors. Looked at all the different systems that were available. This is about 2 or 3 years ago, and then I just pulled the trigger, and I sold all my Canon gear, all of it, all the lenses, all the bodies, and I bought all Fuji gear. So I bought a couple Fuji bodies, I bought a bunch of Fuji lenses, and I pretty much started over. And I got to say, I'm pretty happy with the decision. I was able to go from this giant camera bag to a much smaller camera bag, still be able to carry 2 bodies, 4 lenses, a fraction of the weight. Never hurt my back when I was out hiking. Don't regret it at all. So I love working with the, probably would be similar. With any mirrorless system, you're going to get similar results. So I definitely been very happy with that decision. And it's funny because I remember one time I was in Yosemite, down in the Valley View, where you're down there by the river, and where everybody's lined up with their tripods, and these people with their giant DSLRs and whatnot, and they look at me pull out my little mirrorless camera, and they're like, oh, that's a nice little toy. And I'm like, well, you know what, I'm gonna get great shots, so you can make fun of me all you want, but I'm gonna be really happy with the results I get. And I've got these shots on the wall behind me. I've got some big metal prints that I've shot in Yosemite in infrared that I'm extremely happy with. So that little toy camera did just fine for me. They are APS-C size. So they are, let's see, they I think they're, actually they might be 24 megapixels. I said 16 earlier, but I think they're 24 megapixels. I've been eyeing some of the newer ones that have 26 megapixels, and occasionally, I find myself looking at the medium format Fuji GFX systems that are like 50 or 100 megapixels, and dream about converting one of those to infrared. But yeah, the vast majority of the work that I've done has all been APS-C, not full frame at all. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm. Right. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, absolutely. Shooting in the middle of the day, I feel like it's opened up a whole new window of time that's available. You're just not limited, quite as limited anymore. Yeah, and I had a 70D, a Canon 70D as well. That it wasn't converted, but I definitely shot a lot with it. So I'm pretty familiar with that kind of style of camera, and I put a lot of the full frame Canon glass on it, and got really good results with that. So I could see where that would be a good combination. Right. Yeah, I had a Canon SL1 or an SL2 that I had converted to infrared. I had used it as kind of for a long time. It had been a secondary camera for event shooting. I had used my 70D with a 70 to 200 2.8, and then I had the SL1 with a 24 millimeter pancake lens on it. And then when I wasn't doing event stuff anymore, then I had that camera free, and so that was actually the first camera I converted to infrared, and I was pretty happy with that. But yeah, definitely had to use the live view on that Canon DSLR instead of the viewfinder. Yeah, somebody in my chat said that the Nikon D810 takes gorgeous infrared photos, but it wears me out after a day of exploring. I could totally relate to that, and that's part of the challenge I have when I think about I've always heard great things about those Nikon cameras for landscape, and whenever I dream about getting myself one of those medium format GFX cameras, I'm torn because I know the image quality will be fantastic, but I'm not sure if I want to be carrying it around. Let's see here. Any other questions? Oh yeah, absolutely. I've done a number of panos. I've got yeah, I tend to I've done a few like in the Smoky Mountains that I'm really happy with. And honestly, pano stitching is pretty much no different than it is with regular light. I would say definitely easier with a converted camera. So most of the panos I've done just handheld with a converted camera, just sitting up there on the mountain going, and taking a bunch, and yeah, it works just pretty much just like it does with visible light. So I've been very very happy with the panos that I've taken in infrared. I've even explored, the all the equipment, the tripods and the nodal sliders and all of that kind of stuff. But because of course, if you get all that extra equipment, you could do very precise stitching. But it's never quite meshed with my sort of run and gun style of shooting. That tends to work well. So I haven't. Someday I might get into that, but I the run and gun is too appealing for me, so I've stuck with that. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Exactly. For landscapes. Yeah. Not as big of a deal for sure. Yep. Sure. Hmm. Yep. Right. Right. Sure. So when I converted my first camera, this was actually before the newer Chrome style was available, so that pretty much wasn't a factor. And I at the time I wasn't too interested in ultraviolet. So what I wanted a style that I thought I might like, but I wanted flexibility. And so for that reason, my first conversion, and actually my second conversion also, was a 590 nanometer. And the reason for that is that with a 590 right out of the camera, I could shoot 590 with no external filters, but I can add 720, 665 filters, 720 filters, 800, 850, 900. I can add a ton of filters to get a variety of different styles. And I've really liked that method of shooting. My next conversion will probably be a full spectrum. I actually do have a one full spectrum camera. I've got the Kolari Pocket, which is a pocket camera, kind of a point and shoot camera that's been converted to full spectrum. So if you're interested in an affordable way to get into a converted camera, you can get a Kolari Pocket and a whole bunch of filters for it for like $300. And it's a pocket camera, so the resolution's not going to be the best, but it gives you full spectrum and chrome and all of the filter types, and creatively it's amazing. But my the cameras that I've converted directly have been 590, and I really liked the flexibility. Although, occasionally I see something that somebody's shot with chrome, and I'm like, ooh, I really need a full spectrum camera and one of those chrome filters. Particularly, there was some stuff that came out of this latest Kolari Vision contest. A lot of people think they think you can't shoot infrared in the winter. But there was some shots that were done with the chrome filter in winter, and what's amazing is that the evergreens become red, and the contrast against the white snow, and you put that in like a dramatic landscape, like a mountain scene, and it's just like, oh wow, it was amazing. So I might like to get a full spectrum camera and shoot more chrome if I can. But I've done a ton with the 590 filter. It's been sort of the jack of all trades for me. I can use it. I can add a filter to it. I can convert it to black and white. A lot of my black and white infrareds are just straight up 590s with no other filters. So it's been very flexible, and I've been extremely happy with the 590. Yeah, right. No, no, you still can't. You can do even more. You have even more choices with a full spectrum. It's just that in all likelihood with a full spectrum, you're almost, unless you're deliberately shooting full spectrum and wanting all of those color casts, you're probably going to always be adding a filter to a full spectrum camera of some variety. So it just depends on what you're shooting. Unless you like that style of what comes out of a full spectrum. But it tends to be, I don't want to, unnatural is not the right word, because like all of infrared's unnatural, right? But it's unnatural in the sense that it produces really weird skin tones and other things, and it's just these tones that look unflattering, I guess. Whereas when you get really creative with some of your colors, yeah, it's unrealistic, but it's in a more flattering sense. So you just don't see as many people shooting full spectrum. So if you get a full spectrum camera, which I recommend people do if they're really interested, you're probably going to want external filters to go along with it. Yeah, yeah, right. It's it is picking not only picking the camera to convert, but picking what you're going to convert it to. It's like a decision. It's like it has gravity. It's like, oh, what am I going to do? It's permanent. Oh, I got to live with this choice. And yeah, it's $275, but then it's the cost of the camera itself, and I frequently am prone to analysis paralysis, and so this hobby doesn't help that at all when I get into having to pick what I want to do for a conversion. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think you need it, but I think you will enjoy it more. I think that, you know, like, let me give you an example. Like with the DSLR that I had, that SL1, it had a fixed screen. So, you know, I'm always trying to shoot near the ground, over my head, all these different configurations. I'm not as flexible as I used to be. And, you know, that fixed screen, and sometimes in bright daylight, you know, I get the perfect shot, but then I get this weird glare on the screen. And I bought a hood, you know, for it. And it's just like, it just kind of gets out of control, you know? And so just having a newer camera with a flip up or a flip out screen, you know, and I'm at a point now where I'm like, I will not buy another camera that has a fixed screen. I just won't do it, you know, because it's, you know, my back won't forgive me. But and that's just one example. But you start to look at things like, yeah, the screen resolution, focus peaking, you know, those focus assist tools. There's just so many. When I made the jump from a DSLR to mirrorless, there was so many little like intangibles that came along with it that I wasn't even aware of I was going to get, you know, like the digital level, and, you know, just some of this stuff that you don't even think of in the DSLR world, because I mean, in some it probably exists, but definitely in the consumer models I was buying, some of these capabilities didn't exist. So, you know, if you're looking to minimize your cost, minimize your risk, converting an old camera is definitely a way to go. You know, there's actually, one of the things that I do is I have these, I'm going to give away one of my secrets now, which I'll probably regret later, but I have a bunch of searches that I run on eBay that I get alerts whenever there's infrared cameras. Because, you know, people get into infrared and then they're like, I'm not into it anymore. I'm going to sell my camera and I'm going to sell it for cheap. And then you can go on eBay and you can buy a camera that's been converted. And sometimes you're only paying for like the cost of the camera, not really the conversion, because it's cheaper. So if you're willing to wait and be patient, you can say, oh, well, I want a Sony camera of this mount, infrared, and I'll just search and wait for the result to come up, and then I can snag a deal. And so that's definitely an option. But if you find yourself really liking infrared and shooting it a lot, and it's a creative outlet for you, then you're probably going to want to lean towards, you know, it doesn't have to be the latest and greatest camera, but probably something within the last few years is going to get you more features that you're going to be happy with, just like it would for visible light. So it just, you know, it really comes down to your investment, what you want to spend, and really how much time you're going to commit to it, you know, and how much you enjoy the hobby. So, of course, yeah. Yes, the 590, which is sometimes called a super color. So it can be a I like to talk in the cutoff values, because those are more consistent across manufacturers, but a lot of the manufacturers will use different names, and sometimes you got to read between the lines to see the actual cutoff values. But I think for Life Pixel, that's the super blue or super color. Oh yeah. Hmm. Yep. The focusing can be challenging. I've owned a T5i myself. That was sort of one of my primary cameras for a long time, many years ago. But yeah, for infrared, it's definitely you're gonna have some focusing challenges, and you're gonna have to rely on that live view. You're welcome. So so one of the things that I've done a lot of is I've shot a lot of succulents in black and white infrared, and I've been very happy with how that looks. Some of them I think are very striking, and I really like the look of that. That doesn't really quite get into macro. I've started to kind of experiment with it, but I haven't quite found the right lens yet. Hot spots tend to be a challenge. The problem that I have right now, and I haven't invested a ton of time into it, admittedly, but like the Fuji 60 millimeter macro lens, which is a pretty nice macro lens, has horrible hotspots in infrared, so that doesn't work. Of course. And then like a lot of the vintage lenses that I've picked up are not macro lenses, and so I've tried to do macro-like stuff, but the focusing distance is terrible. So I do have some like extension tubes. I might try that at some point and see if I could get something to work. But I don't think I've found the right lens yet. That's probably a tricky combination. I don't know if hotspots are more common with macro lenses or not. I'm not really sure yet. I do have, yeah, I do have the Fuji 55-200, which I think is a macro, and that doesn't have hotspots with wide open apertures. But yeah, it's a space that would need more research and exploration. And of course, the other challenge with macro is going to be light, right? You're going to need, macro in and of itself needs a lot of light. And so what are you going to do? Like, are you shooting macro outdoors with daylight? If you're shooting indoors, you're going to need some serious light to pull that off. Yeah, that's good. That's going to be tricky. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's the challenge of mixing the infrared genre with a different genre, and your results may vary. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and on that subject, infrared can be really tricky for portraiture. It really does funky stuff to skin tones. We looked at some examples of UV, which is certainly very interesting, although maybe a more limited application. I've done some, like, I guess you'd call it maybe street photography-ish kind of stuff in infrared, but it tends to be like people's backs, the kind of thing that don't show people's faces because they look really unnatural in infrared. So I've never been a big portrait shooter anyway. I've been more of a landscape person, so I've just kind of steered away from portraiture. Any other questions? Where was that at? Ah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, there's also a couple, 2 or 3 Facebook groups that cover infrared. Couple groups, one of them specifically focused on criticism, and there might even be a fourth one that does portraiture. So if you're interested, you can either just share work or you can look for feedback on your work as well. So a variety of locations for that. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Succulents have been one of my favorite subjects. So there's lots of, and of course in the Bay Area, there's lots of great places. I've shot at Berkeley, the gardens there, Bancroft Gardens in Walnut Creek. Lots of great places with succulents. So great subject in infrared. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your attention and the questions. And if you have any further questions, feel free to connect with me. You can send me a message through my website, or you can comment on any of the videos. But by all means, take advantage of that if you have any further questions, and feel free to reach out if you have more. Oh, thank you so much. Alrighty. Take care.